Good morning, and this is what all our lectures have been leading us towards, the new Hollywood, and what was this Hollywood new wave, so called Hollywood new wave. And in one of my earlier classes I mentioned that if there is a new Hollywood, then there has to be an old Hollywood as well. So what was that old Hollywood? Classic Hollywood. Okay, any other term for that? Good, golden age of Hollywood. And when you look at key concept that we are going to revise today, so classic Hollywood, of course we will revisit very briefly today. So remember what were the features of the plot, how was the story told, the narrative, how were the characters sketched in old Hollywood system, what was the concept of stardom all about, think close-ups, think photography, think the acting style, studio system, you remember the studio system, how studios controlled stars and everything that came with it, the complete act of movie making, editing style, music. So these are the key concepts that we will be thinking and discussing today with reference to new Hollywood, but you should always be able to revisit classic Hollywood also against this background, because that is where we come from. So what was the background of new Hollywood? There was a motorcycle club established in 1953 by Rocky Graves. It was called Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, okay, and they were known for their free spirited, iconic and bound by brotherhood and loyalty tendencies. When you watch a movie like Marlon Brando's, which movie we have been talking about? The biker movie, The Wild One. Okay. When you think of the Wild One came somewhere in early 50s. Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper's definitive seminal movie. This is the movie that heralded the age of new wave Hollywood, Easy Rider. Okay. And when was this released? In 1967. Okay. But biker movies were nothing new. We had The Wild One, and after that we had several B category, the so called B movies of biker genre. Peter Fonda himself starred in a movie called The Wild Angels, which was yet another biker movie. So that preceded this. So Peter Fonda was anyway a biker, you know, a biker star as we call it. So if John Wayne was the ultimate Western on a Western hero on horseback, okay, here we had another kind of hero always on a bike. So that, and Dennis Hopper, let me tell you, hated bikes, okay, as much as Peter Fonda loved them. You know, Peter Fonda comes from Hollywood royalty. His father is the great Henry Fonda and sister is another great Jane Fonda. Okay. So that's his background. So this is one thing that ushered in the era of the new Hollywood movement. So why are we interested in Hells Angels and motorcycle clubs, things like that? Because they suggested free spiritedness, okay, and that's how we will get, that's what Hollywood new wave was all about, how it came about. Now that was also a period when certain cultural revolutions were taking place in America, and the music scene, who were the people in foreground? Bob Dylan and the Doors. Okay. So that is one thing, the kind of music they wrote, the kind of performances that they excelled in, it all suggested a revolution of sorts from what was happening before. Elvis Presley, many people quote Elvis Presley also, but he was very tame, very orthodox as compared to these people. Elvis, after all, apart from his dance movements, he was quite conservative. He upheld the traditional values and beliefs, but not Bob Dylan, not the Doors. So that is the importance of that, the period, the music of that period. We also had people like Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, and Andy Warhol, the ultimate in cool, okay, in popular culture, in popular art. You know the Campbell soup cans, the entire story, yeah. If you do not know, please do that. The Marilyn, the Elizabeth Taylor prints, Okay, Google Andy Warhol and you will understand. So, that is another name that you should know. In popular culture, now we are talking about pop culture and Andy Warhol. That is an important name. So, influence of these people. So, we are going towards this kind of cinema and we are looking at the socio-political historical context in which new Hollywood cinema can be located. Okay. So, these things are very important when you look at something. If there is a new Hollywood, then there has to be a background to it. So, these were the factors that led to the emergence of this new Hollywood. There was not something radical happening, there was no single factor, but a variety of factors which were all belong to popular culture, politics as well as other things, even cinema. So, European cinema was yet another major influence on new Hollywood cinema. For example, Blow Up. Blow Up was a cultural revolution in terms of cinema. Of course, we had 8½ by Fellini, of course, we had Godard, but then Blow Up by Antonioni was his first English movie in English language. It was made in Britain with British actors. Remember that, Vanessa Redgrave and yeah. So, David Hemmings. So, that is the background, and Alfie with Michael Caine. Again, what is Alfie all about? It is about a free spirited young man of a particular society. Okay. So, entire age, the entire movement was influenced in one. If there has to be a takeaway, what is the takeaway? Anti-establishment, anti-authoritarian and free spiritedness. Those were the three features that characterized the entire movement. And Vimal would know that from 80s onwards, it was a throwback to the earlier times, 80s onwards, when we had cinema of Sylvester Stallone and Schwarzenegger. So, it was actually harking back to the John Wayne category. Okay. But in between there was a period which was very radical, and Hollywood, let us be very clear about it, much of the respect that Hollywood enjoys is centered, or it emanates from this cinema, this particular period, the so called new Hollywood cinema, the 10-15 years of excellence in cinema. Okay. So, golden age, yes, Otto Preminger, yes, okay, very important, Hitchcock, Billy Wilder, they were always there, but then after that there was a lull, and what brought about that lull, those are also the factors that we will be looking at. Okay. Now, political causes that led to the emergence of new Hollywood cinema. People were feeling a kind of unrest with the political system, the war in Vietnam, and there were protests against the war, lots of anti-war feelings. You should also know something about the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where students came out in university campuses and protested against many of the US foreign policies. Major political assassinations, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So, that is Robert Kennedy. And then Stonewall riots, also JFK, but that came before. Robert Kennedy was in late 60s along with Martin Luther King, back to back, two major political assassinations. So, what did they suggest? What did they symbolize? Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther. What did they stand for? Yeah, liberalism. Okay. And there are regressive forces which do not want liberals to take forth or take the center stage. That is the idea. Therefore, they have to be eliminated and assassinated. So, this entire Hollywood new wave cinema was also a response to these things. And of course, you know Stonewall riots, anti-gay riots, and what happened, and we have a response to that also in the form of Dog Day Afternoon. Yes, we have seen that movie. Okay. Now, Hollywood new wave, the immediate causes, of course, there were socio-political and cultural causes, but the immediate factor was of course money, like most of the time. And the reason was that in the mid 60s, because of the invasion and proliferation of so many television channels, television became very big that time. Okay. So, people chose to stay at home and watch films at home instead of going out to the theatres. So, in US theatre attendance was declining fast. So, the filmmakers wanted to give them something new, bring the public back to the theatres. What do they give them? What can inspire, what can motivate these people to come back to the theatres? That is the idea. And what was the reason why people did not want to go to the theatres anymore? Well, there were mindless star vehicles, just putting together a bunch of stars and making a movie around them, okay, without much attention to the narrative, the plot, the acting style, but it was just like that. Musicals, for example, Dr. Dolittle, which followed the tremendous success of My Fair Lady, starring again Rex Harrison. Dr. Dolittle, not Eddie Murphy, but Rex Harrison version of it, which bombed badly. Bloated epics, for example, Cleopatra. Okay, so, these were the things, and Cleopatra almost led to the closing down of 20th Century Fox studio. It was such a big debacle. So, studios were sinking, and what happens when studios are sinking? The producers thought that we have to think of new way of storytelling, give chance to newer people, new actors, new directors, and experiment with new forms of storytelling, new forms of movies. So, that was the idea, and they started looking towards Europe. Okay, there is a revolution happening in Europe. There is Fellini. Okay, there is a movie called L'Avventura, where nothing actually happens, but it became big. Blow Up. What is the plot of Blow Up? We do not know. Well, you can think about it, but there is no story as such. Much of it is in style. So, they thought, why not focus on style, okay, and gives audience something to think over without telling them too much or giving them too much of melodrama. So, that was the idea. Another major influence was development in science and technology, and there were people, documentary specialists, who practiced something called cinema verite. That means real life cinema, realistic cinema. Verite is real. So, these people, Richard Leacock, Penbaker and the Maisel brothers, what did they do? They developed cheap, lightweight and easily accessible equipments. And what did this lead to? What Godard did, okay, and what people like Vittorio De Sica did in Bicycle Thieves. They could take these equipments out of the studios and shoot real people and real life on streets. Okay, so, development of lightweight equipments. So, new Hollywood cinema just did not happen in a vacuum. There were socio-political, cultural reasons, also technical causes and political causes. So, it was a combination of several factors that led to the emergence of the so called new wave Hollywood cinema. Otherwise, we would not have a movie like Easy Rider. Okay, if big movies, big budgeted movies, big star vehicles were still doing well, then why do you need to invest in a movie like Easy Rider? Okay, that is the thing. So, Easy Rider is at the center of the entire movement. Now, there was also a movie which came a few months before Easy Rider, and it is called Bonnie and Clyde. We have already talked about it, and because of its anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment theme, it came as a shock to the system. Andrew Sarris, who we have already discussed, he referred to the movie as cinema of alienation, anomie, anarchy and absurdism, but all these things in very positive context. And who was Arthur Penn? The director, and he famously said, we are in the Vietnam War and that is the way movies have to be made. This film cannot be immaculate and sanitized and bang bang, it has to be bloody. And why should it be bloody? Reflects the sentiments of that period. Okay, so you can't just have a gunshot, you just hear a gunshot somewhere on screen and then see a long take or long shot of a dead body without any blood. That's how murders would be shot on screen. You were talking about Laura and Otto Preminger. It's about a murder that happens. Okay, Laura is supposedly murdered. You never see any dead body. You never see any bloodshed. You just hear a gunshot going somewhere. Okay, that was the maximum violence. The Big Sleep was considered a very violent movie for its times. Howard Hawks' The Big Sleep. But where is the blood there? So here the movies cannot afford to be sanitized anymore. Why? After all, there were world wars, the First World War, Second World War, then also. So America had been through serious bloodshed. All these movies were in one way a response to the Vietnam War. Taxi Driver, Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now of course goes to the heart of the action. So this is the movie 1967, Bonnie and Clyde, Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway, directed by Arthur Penn. Robert Towne worked on the screenplay of Bonnie and Clyde. At the same time, you also had a movie like The Graduate, again extremely anti-authoritarian, starring Dustin Hoffman and Bancroft, directed by Mike Nichols. The first wave directors, here you see a still of the great, which director is he? John Cassavetes. He was also an actor. He was the leading man in which movie? Rosemary's Baby. Okay? Yeah. So the first wave directors, here is a list and it's a Hall of Fame like list. Peter Bogdanovich, we will talk about him. We have already discussed Francis Ford Coppola extensively, The Godfather. Dennis Hopper, Peter Fonda, Easy Rider. John Cassavetes, several movies which need attention. Arthur Penn, Mike Nichols and Kubrick. So there were two waves of new Hollywood cinema directors. This is the first wave. Second wave, of course, you know, Scorsese at the forefront. Cassavetes, for example, in one way became a mentor to Scorsese. He was the one who encouraged him to go on. When he first watched his movie, who is that knocking at the door? Okay, now what was happening here in the new Hollywood scenario? Directors, rather than studios or producers or stars, directors enjoyed more power, more prestige and consequently greater wealth. So the attention was now on the directors. And they did not call themselves just directors, they were not metteur en scène. Remember those words? Metteur en scène, just putting together a scene, but they become authors. So they prided themselves on becoming authors. Therefore, they assume the mantle of the artist, they are not merely metteur en scène. Developed personal styles distinct from that of other directors. And this is something you will find, like we have been talking about authorism in Hitchcock extensively. You have to understand that authorism always existed, but here it was taken to another level because greater degree of freedom existed. Now, Bonnie and Clyde, it needs some attention, and the story was it is a real life story. There were bank robbers called Bonnie and Clyde during the Depression era, and this story appeared in a magazine called Esquire, which is still in circulation, by Robert Benton and David Newman, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. And the story, the screenplay was much appreciated by Warren Beatty, who also wanted to produce the film, and therefore he was in conflict with Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers till that time were not used to having told what to do. But then Warren Beatty convinced them that this is a new kind of a story which needs to be told using new technology. So, all those things that we have been talking about, shooting on locations, handheld cameras, showing lot of blood and gore and violence, graphic violence on screen. So, Beatty somehow convinced Warner Brothers that this movie needs to be produced, but then they said that we will pay you very little for this. He said, fine, I will have a share in the profits of the movie, and they naturally thought that anyway this movie is not going to make any profit. So, they signed away the profits of the movies to the actor, and then we all know what happened later. The movie became a huge hit, phenomenal hit. Warren Beatty became an iconic figure. So, they were bank robbers, and most of the casting was done from New York as opposed to from Hollywood, standard Hollywood assembly line productions. Violence was extremely real life like verisimilitude. And one allegation and part of its charm was that it brazenly romanticizes the outlaws, the misfits, the robbers and killers. Remember, Bonnie and Clyde are robbers and killers. Later on, Oliver Stone paid homage to this movie in the form of Natural Born Killers. This was the first time when audiences watched blasting holes on the screen. Okay. And there is a scene, because the movie followed Robert Kennedy's assassination. Okay. His assassination had just happened, and when at the end, in the climactic shootout, when Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway are killed on screen by the cops, we actually see Warren Beatty's head, part of his head shot off. That kind of violence had never been shown on screen before. Hero's head being shot off, a part of it. How graphic could that be? Think of that. So, initially when the movie was first released, it was absolutely trashed by the right wing critics like Bosley Crowther. He was a critic for the New York Times, and he had a thing against violence on screen, and he trashed the movie. If you just look up the criticism on the net, then you will find you will see the language he uses for the movie. However, another esteemed critic, Pauline Kael, she helped revive its fortunes, its prospects. So, the movie was re-released, and then it went on to become a blockbuster, because Pauline Kael liked the movie a lot, and but see, so that is the reason in one of our earlier classes we have been talking about how important film writing could be, writing about films. So, some of you can perhaps think of a career in film writing. Okay. And it is a very prestigious, very important, you are not just doing some kind of a service to anyone. Okay. You are actually doing a very academic job. If writing is your thing, then film writing is a very serious profession, and that is why we have so much respect for people like Roger Ebert and David Thompson and David Bordwell and Pauline Kael, who raised the profession of criticism and film writing to the level of art. A little before Bonnie and Clyde, you have a movie called A Hard Day's Night. I think we have done excerpts from this movie also, the Beatles picture, directed by Richard Lester. So, this movie in a way became a precursor to the entire movement, starring the Beatles as themselves. The Beatles picture, why was it important? Because it was the kind of movie that defied genres. It is not a musical, it has music, but it is not a musical just to be a vehicle for the Beatles. It is not. The Beatles, who were already a publicity phenomenon, starred in it, and again, like all new wave cinema, it was extremely anti-authoritarian, something that people like Truffaut had taught us in 400 Blows, Godard had told us in Breathless, Okay, so it was continuing in the same tradition. The film is irreverent. You have seen how they treat their manager, okay, and all the older people in the movie. Extremely joyous, they are being themselves, and it's extremely original. Okay, there has never been any movie like that before. There were Elvis Presley movies, musicals, but they are all extremely tame, not in the same vein. Okay. So, A Hard Day's Night is also known for its immortal music. I do not know how many of you are into popular culture and Beatles, but yeah, the songs are absolutely on top. And Richard Lester is credited for reinventing the grammar of cinema. And but by grammar of cinema, again we mean the same things, classic Hollywood. So, there has to be a plot, strong focus on characterization. There has to be a narrative. What narrative, Vimal? What? Linear narrative and continuity editing. Remember? But in Easy Rider, as you just watched, how many of you watched or paid attention to the fact that editing was not linear? There were jumps there, so called jump cuts. Why? Who did the cinematography? Laszlo Kovacs, you should know that name. Okay, Laszlo Kovacs. Okay, so you have things like the movie has documentary look, something which was unheard of till then. Used handheld cameras, and so much of shooting was done on location. Quick cutting, overlapping of dialogues, intercutting of dialogues. The Beatles are always interviewed on the run, and they are chased by fans as they are running on the streets. And music is under documentary action. So, it is almost like it is a documentary on Beatles, but it is not. But the feel is that as if it is a documentary, and it is shot in black and white in the times of color. So, that is about the background, that two major movies that heralded this new wave Hollywood cinema. One was A Hard Day's Night, and much more graphic, much more forceful, Bonnie and Clyde. Now, from here we come to key people of new Hollywood period, BBS. Three names: producer Bert Schneider. Now, usually in this course we have not been talking about producers all that much, right? We talked about a studio system. We also talked about, to an extent, Cecil DeMille, or David Selznick, Gone with the Wind. So, we have been talking about some studio mughals, but we have not been talking too much about producers and how important producers were in fostering the new Hollywood wave. So, Bert Schneider is at the top. He was a producer, and they had a company called Ray Burt Films, which produced Easy Rider. Bob Rafelson was his creative head and all his partner, his friend, and also director. Steve Blonner. So, BBS comes from Bert, Bob and Steve. BBS. It was a company that enabled directors to make the kind of films they want to without interfering and without trying to control them creatively. So, they are often credited for ushering in the cinematic renaissance of the 60s. So, BBS is a name that you should remember. The great Bert Schneider, very colorful personality, known for several things, extremely innovative, extremely bold. So, Bert Schneider, who won the Academy Award for making the best documentary, recently passed away in 2011 and came into the limelight with his production of Easy Rider. Bert Schneider had originally made his money by producing a television series called The Monkees, which was based along the same lines as A Hard Day's Night. It was a musical television serial starring 4 young men who would sing songs and their lives are almost in the same vein as the Beatles. They were called the Monkees, and it was a smash hit, and they made pots of money from the Monkees and then went on to produce some serious cinema. So, what did they do? They encouraged the kind of cinema that demanded improvisation, breakdown of the linear editing system, quite Brechtian by the way they broke the fourth wall, and free flowing loose narratives. Did you find that in Easy Rider? Free flowing narrative? Is there a narrative in Easy Rider? You have watched the movie, Vimal. Is there a, focus on him please. Is there a narrative in Easy Rider? How much of it? I mean, is there a very strong plot? Is it plot driven?
Well, in terms of narrative closure, maybe not.
Well, it's a road movie. Okay, you can't say that Easy Rider has a narrative because they never had a screenplay of that movie. Okay, it was all improvised, done on location. They didn't know what they were doing. Okay, they would just go shoot a lot of stuff on streets, and then at the end, Bert Schneider sat down and edited it out. Okay, and the kind of movie that we see, if there is a plot, it's thanks to Bert Schneider's efforts, not because of Dennis Hopper. Okay, so Bert Schneider, the producer, did the editing. He was an extremely talented person, and he took complete control over the movie because Dennis Hopper obviously was not that balanced enough to take control of such a monumental task like editing, and Bert Schneider did it. So, that you feel that there is a plot, but the fact is that there was no story, no screenplay. They worked without any screenplay. Although in the titles you find that 3 people are credited with the story: Peter Fonda, Dennis Hopper, Terry Southern. They must have done something. They must have thrown around a bit of ideas here and there, but there was no screenplay. So, fluidity, that is what we are talking about, fluidity and free flowing narrative, which was again, that was pioneered by European filmmakers. By the same logic, I can even tell you that Breathless does not have a narrative. It does not have a closure, it does not have a narrative. It just flows. Basically style is at the center, okay, rather than plot. It is more about the kind of signature that you will leave behind, rather than creating a story, unlike the Howard Hawks of the world, people who were extremely talented, but they were told to do a story. Okay, this is a story, stick to this screenplay, make a movie out of it. New wave directors did not believe in that. It may appear very shocking to you how such great cinema came out of such indiscipline, but that was the kind, that was part of their innovations. Okay, and BBS then went on to direct a list of great films of the Hollywood New Wave era. So, some of the most important films of this period are, of course, Easy Rider, Head, which was directed by Bob Rafelson, Lost and Found, 5 easy pieces starring who? Jack Nicholson. It is very European in nature. Drive, he said, directed by who? Drive, he said, directed by Jack Nicholson. A Safe Place, The Last Picture Show, we are going to talk about the film, The King of Marvin Gardens. So, that is the BBS list, very avant-garde-ish, very experimental kind of cinema. And when you get your Coppolas and when you get your Scorseses and someone like Peter Bogdanovich, then you have to credit the BBS people for this. They were the one who started. It was also the period when we had a movie by John Boorman, Point Blank, 1967, and surprisingly a very violent movie from the stable, from the house of MGM. It begins with a shot of a battered and almost dead Lee Marvin It's extremely brutal, very oblique, and most unlike any movie that came out of any old studio system. But that was a period when the studio had thought that we have to encourage this sort of cinema in order to survive. Therefore, a movie like Point Blank came out. So, even old guard started rethinking, renewing their strategies. That is the idea. Kubrick's 2001, if you have watched the movie, you will know what I am trying to tell you, extremely avant-garde-ish. Is there a plot? I am talking about the plot that we were used to in the golden age of Hollywood. Do you get that kind of plot in Easy Rider or Drive, he said, or 2001 A Space Odyssey? You do not. Remember, cause and effect, always go back to that. Do you find that cause and effect thing here? Forget the closure, of course there was no closure in all these movies, but things did not happen because of that cause and effect model, a complete disintegration of that earlier model. Therefore, golden age is golden age because there were strong stories, emphasis on narratives and plot, not here. Cassavetes. So, Faces is his important movie, and A Woman Under the Influence, yet another great movie by Cassavetes. New Hollywood cinema characterized by growth of independent, the so called indie cinema, right Vimal? You keep on talking about indie cinema. So, power shifted from the studio to directors, less to actors, but more to directors, and emergence of something called the road movie, literally coming out of the folds of the studio. Another feature, now we were talking about editing. So, old Hollywood linear editing, new Hollywood non-linear editing, discontinuous editing. So, fast motion, slow motion, long takes, jump cuts, and you just watched a clipping from Easy Rider where you have lots of that watch, the scene of the wristwatch on the ground. What is that all about? How did that come about? Jump cut. We will go back to that scene later on in the movie. So, watch the film. So, editing was no longer unobtrusive, but called attention to itself. An emphasis on sync sound method, that is recording the sound while filming the picture and not dubbing. In India for a long time we had dubbing, and we also had dubbing artists. Heroines, they just look pretty, but they can't speak, they have no sense of dialogue delivery. So, you use them for their dancing skills and for their beauty and get the dialogues dubbed. Anyway, they did not have much to do in the movie. So, a dubbing artist would dub all their dialogues. So, that was something that continued for a very long time. Okay, Clute by Alan J. Pakula, 1971, Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland. So, those were the stars of that period, and again it deals with the theme, and voyeurism and theme of surveillance becomes very important in new Hollywood cinema. Why surveillance is so important? Vimal, can you tell me?
The Red Scare.
Okay. It was there to an extent, Cold War and all, but he is thinking of that. But one very immediate factor, Watergate scandal. Okay. So, therefore, paranoia in American society, all of us are being spied on. So, voyeurism, surveillance, avoidance of closure, satisfactory closure, openness, ambiguity even about characters. So, no more good and bad people, but very morally ambiguous people. That is something you find even in Hitchcock, but now more and more widespread, more and more common. Conversation by Coppola, again along the same lines. Coppola was following, it's one of his most personal films. So, he was following the Watergate break-in scandal and deals with the theme of surveillance. Gene Hackman is Harry Cole. And movie is again less about plot and more of a character study of the man. It is about him and what he goes through, the alienation of a man whose job is to spy on others, that is all. The famous toilet flushing scene is a homage to the shower scene in Psycho. Have you seen the conversation? Have you? Okay, so we are told that a murder is taking place in the hotel room next door to Harry's. He does not want to interfere, he does not try to stop the murder. Later on, much later, when he enters that same room and flushes the toilet, it overflows with blood, and that is a very shocking image. Another important director of that period, Mike Nichols. First major film, successful film was Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf, Burton Taylor, based on Edward Albee's play. He became a hotshot director following the success of The Graduate, and then Carnal Knowledge with Jack Nicholson and Candice Bergen. He also made a very unsuccessful adaptation of Catch-22, Joseph Heller's novel. The movie is Catch-22, but it did not do well. Why did not it do well? Because it was released simultaneously with Robert Altman's MASH. And look at the way MASH deals with war, and Catch-22 is quite tame as compared to the complete irreverent treatment of MASH. Peter Bogdanovich, another important, very influential director of that period. He is also film writer and a scholar, and Who the Devil Made It. It is an anthology of interviews with Orson Welles, John Ford and Howard Hawks. You know these people, right? By now you know all these names. He wrote a book called John Ford. It is a biography and a study of John Ford's works, 1978, and this is Orson Welles, 1992. So, books by Peter Bogdanovich, who is best remembered for his The Last Picture Show, Jeff Bridges and Sybil Shepherd. So, early works by Peter Bogdanovich, they include, he actually collaborated with Roger Corman, who was a legendary B movie filmmaker, on The Wild Angels. We were just talking about it, starring Peter Fonda, John Wayne of the biker flicks. He debuted with a thriller, Targets, about a mad sniper and an aging horror film star played by Boris Karloff. So, those were the earlier works. Before The Last Picture Show, we had The Wild Angels, on which he worked on the script of the movie and then directed Targets. What is it all about? It's shot in black and white. It's a 1971 movie, shot in black and white. Why do you think Bogdanovich uses black and white tone for the movie?
Maybe I don't think the movie talks about life in 1971. Right?
No.
So maybe it's a homage to the era in which the movie is filmed.
It's a throwback. It's a nostalgic piece. Therefore, perhaps he needed that kind of look. It's set during the Depression era. Theatres are closing down, and the movie ends on a very sad, very haunting note, which is the last picture they watch. The closing down of the only film theatre in that small town of Arlene in Texas. The things are so bad that they have to shut down the only theatre, and this theatre was once upon a time a haven, a place for escaping, but now things have become so bad that they have to close down the theatre. The Last Picture Show. Which is the last picture they get to watch? The Red River by Howard Hawks. So, again this is a homage by a fan, Peter Bogdanovich, to Howard Hawks. Red River is starring John Wayne and Monty Clift. So, shot in black and white, and the movie has a very sparse, very dusty look. If you watch it, it is not at all a pretty picture. Yeah, it says a lot of serious things. Basically, it is like that coming of age movie, but then it is a very sad, very somber take on coming of age thing. And of course, it has Peter Bogdanovich belonged to that group of directors who were heavily influenced by the European style of filmmaking. So, themes of loss and alienation, again you find this in this movie as well. Peter Bogdanovich's other successes included What's Up Doc, it is a comedy, Barbara Streisand and Ryan O'Neal. Paper Moon, real life father daughter combination, Ryan and Tatum O'Neal. Tatum O'Neal became really big after this movie. She was called on stage to present the Academy Awards to Robert De Niro for Raging Bull. I am sorry, not for Raging Bull, for the second Godfather. Yes. Peter Bogdanovich went through a very bad patch, but are you familiar with this movie, The Cat's Meow? It is like, you know, gaining some lost ground, but happened much later in 2001. The Cat's Meow starring a very young Kirsten Dunst, and it is a piece of historical conjecture where William Hearst, you remember William Hearst from our Citizen Kane, yeah, so he is on a yacht where he has a group of celebrity guests including Loela Parson and Charlie Chaplin. They are going for a just getaway to Catalina, and then there is a murder on yacht. So, it is a mix of comedy as well as suspense thrillers in the Hitchcockian mold. Kirsten Dunst in The Cat's Meow. So, that is Peter Bogdanovich for you. And then Robert Altman. Robert Altman, known for MASH, you can look at the still, extremely irreverent and anti-authoritarian. Just look at the still very closely. And then there was another great movie, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, starring Warren Beatty and Julie Christie, a British actress. Altman's most prestigious movie is Nashville. It is an ensemble cast, it is a musical, and it is also an extremely political movie without explicitly stating its politics. So, Nashville. So, those are the three must watch of Robert Altman, Nashville, McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Do you know the story of McCabe and Mrs. Miller? The hero is a gambler, the heroine runs a brothel, and it is set in 19th century. So, the movie was shot extensively on location in Vancouver, and they would have all these snowstorms, and Warren Beatty would insist on several retakes throughout the movie. At the end, the story demands that he be killed, and he is shown buried in snow, and Robert Altman wanted to have his final revenge on Warren Beatty, and he called for 31 retakes for that shot, because throughout the movie Warren Beatty had been demanding too many retakes. No, I am not satisfied with this shot, let us redo it all over again. So, he drove Robert Altman crazy with his demand, persistent demand for so called perfection, you know, actor's vanity. He was huge after Bonnie and Clyde. Okay, so, Robert Altman had his sweet revenge, and when Warren Beatty had to shoot his death scene buried under snow, he made him go through any number of retakes. He said, no, I am not satisfied with this, let us redo it again. After that, Beatty, I am sure, never demanded a retake. Okay. The movie was critically acclaimed, but did not do very well, but today it is an iconic movie, a cult classic. So, at this point we end, and we will meet now next week. Thank you very much.